So many materials go to waste in construction. Things like timbers, chipboard, laminex, tiles, paint, plasterboard and concrete. How can we make people aware of where things have come from? When you begin with the material in mind, it changes what you create. We're really big believers that objects and materials, they do hold stories, they hold meaning, and they do relate to wherever they've come from as well. 5 Mile Radius began in a shed in the outskirts of Brisbane. We were a team of young architects who would come together on the weekends, and we kind of built ourselves a clubhouse. I was very interested to start a practice that had a making component and a designing component. I started an Instagram saying who wants to come and join this kind of collective group. We're going to build things together out of sustainable local materials.
You mean silicosis?
We've been going for about 6 years now. When you call your practice 5 Mile Radius, I mean, it was a very deliberate kind of call to arms for us. Mahatma Gandhi had this philosophy of using materials from within a 5 mile radius of your site. You tend to support your local environment. Buildings look like they've come from a specific region, so they're very culturally significant. All of these things work together to kind of create these meaningful buildings that seemed born of their place. When I finished my studies, I moved to London and I worked in commercial practices. I left London a number of years later and moved to India and looked at work of architects who had this great culture of making. When I first travelled to India, I was working for an architect called B.V. Doshi. He's a very well-known architect. We were working predominantly on university buildings, which used a collection of materials from the local area predominantly. That was very influential to see these natural materials coming together into these buildings. I travelled all over many regions in India and catalogued local materials in their place. Things like walls made from mud or fences made from sticks, tiles made from local clays. And that was how 5 Mile Radius initially actually began. It was just a library of local building material techniques that I'd seen on my travels.
So how did they...
We weren't a business that founded based on a strong economic prospect. It was more about an idea and an ideal and trying to then find a business model that would work for us and allow us to maintain, I guess, some of our ethic. We formed an architecture company that also has a products arm. We try as much as possible to draw funds from particularly our products that allow us to continue to experiment and research in our architecture practice. The concrete industry accounts for about 8% of emissions globally. That is predominantly from the heating up of the raw resources to turn them into a binder, which is why they're so good as in construction. Currently, when you're pouring something, you need to over-order quite often. So you'll have a lot of wet concrete left over that you don't need, and that is sent predominantly to resource recovery or to a landfill, where it's crushed to form road base. It's a bit of a low value use for a very high energy intensive material. Our approach at our workshop is to try and recover as much concrete as possible, which we source wet when it's left over from a pour on a job site. We polish it to make it a terrazzo and we turn that into furniture. We'd rather make furniture something that people will keep and hold on to that will last a lifetime rather than that concrete going into landfill. That's turning something which has a high value into something which also retains that value. Terrazzo traditionally was made up of building rubble, and so we're continuing that kind of legacy here, and we just combine various forms of this aggregate with our concrete mix. We collect bricks and glass and ceramic tile from construction sites around Brisbane. We crush that and then we use that within the terrazzo. It's all stuff that would have otherwise just been going to the tip. why it's called waste terrazzo. We leave them in the moulds for a week, typically. Once it's dried, we flip it out of the mould and then we take it outside, and that's when we grind it. That process polishes it back to a really fine glass-like terrazzo surface. The legs for our tables we make from steel scraps from job sites. We blacken it using linseed oil and heat, and that creates a rust-proof coating on the steel that makes it resistant to corrosion and also just improves its appearance. I guess we're quite different from an architecture practice because we get to making quite quickly. Every idea is really a series of kind of different people coming together. We've got Jack, and he's a carpenter, and he kind of said, look, I'm on job sites all the time and I'm seeing how much of this concrete is just going in the skips. And then, I'd seen a lot of terrazzo work in India, so I knew what you could do with this quite easily. The team would come together over this topic, and that's where the ideas are really born.
We love inspiring you with our YouTube videos. So here's a special bundle from our store to inspire you even more. It includes our new essential guide to your living room, a digital guide packed with expert tips and tricks to help you transform your living room into the perfect space, and our first hardcover book featuring 30 of our favorite small footprint homes, filled with detailed floor plans and gorgeous photography. The bundle is available worldwide from our store just for you. You're welcome.
Every year in Australia, 200,000 timber telegraph poles are cut down due to what is called ground line failure. That's where the base of the timber pole becomes waterlogged. But the rest of the timber pole is still usable Australian hardwood. What quite often happens to telegraph poles when they're cut down is that councils aren't sure how to recycle them, or they're not set up to store the timber and then recondition it for reuse. So they end up going to resource recovery, where they're quite often shredded and then turned into a lower grade material. These are timbers that actually have an infinite lifespan if they're looked after and kind of treated appropriately. We're really interested in timber, especially because it stores carbon. Any material that stores carbon is something that we need to keep in play rather than sending it to landfill, where it's just allowed to degrade and then that carbon is released back into the atmosphere. In this old Taubman's paint factory. Yeah. Take them off. What do you do with all the metal work? You just scrap it? Yep. Kennedy's is great here because they're recognising that this timber still has a lot of life left for it as the hardwood. It's crazy. They dock the poles to length for us, and then they brush the outside. We take them back to our workshop where we cut them to form our telegraph sills. When we were designing the telegraph stills, well, that was a really fun process where we went, okay, well, the goal here is to not waste any timber. They're one log, and then we chainsaw into that and pull it apart. So you've got two stools from one log and they interlock. We quite often sell them in pairs because, the two go back together, and every sort of cut is quite unique. So two will only fit together if they're from the same log. The design was really a kind of everybody in the studio trying to come up with the funnest way that we could do that. And eventually it was Tom O'Shea, he's an architect with us, and he kind of got a chainsaw out and went, I think I could just do this. We burn the outside of the stools. That's called shoshukiban, and that's a Japanese technique for preserving timber. So it means it adds durability to the surface of timber. These are all different types of timber that have all been exposed to different weathering conditions. So the charring just helps them all sort of get a consistent colouring. We use a hard wax oil on the end of that, which is also a natural finish. I think that people like that they can connect the kind of end result to this resource. They can understand, what does happen to telegraph poles and why aren't we reusing that? It's about getting the right material in the right place, and then, their lifespan is incredible. We are working on a bakery for some friends. We're just trying to use as many recovered and recycled materials for them as we can. The legs for all of the tables and chairs and bench seats will be made out of this, which is decommissioned fire sprinkler pipe. It's decommissioned because it's starting to rust, but it's still really good structurally. The idea with the front counter is to create a concrete bench top which will be poured entirely out of waste concrete that will source wet from job sites. Another decision we've made here is to make all the joinery out of plywood, which we pulled out of a previous retail job that we'd done. I mean, the guys are so on board with reusing stuff. It's never like, oh, this whole thing is circular. It's a series of small decisions that really help get you to a place that's a bit different from usual. And it's also about us just helping them understand the philosophy of being able to pull things apart at the ends so that you can recover things at their end of life. Obviously, you'll never have a new building which is made in a commercial setting entirely from recovered materials. In Australia, it's both a blessing and a curse that we have quite a stringent construction code. In mainstream construction, there just isn't enough suppliers and avenues yet to kind of do things in a way that might make them more sustainable or easier to recover or recycle. Designers just need to be given more options and more education. I don't think it's that the individuals aren't necessarily interested in it, it's just not yet mainstream kind of knowledge. There's lots of great references, you just need to know where to look. Designers, I guess, have a responsibility to put things in front of the consumer that are responsibly sourced and that have considered what's going to happen when the consumer no longer wants them. The more we can do to connect the consumer to the source, that's one of the roles of designers today. As a practice, I think our hopes and dreams would be to see architects question, I guess, some of the structures of the way the profession is practiced. We're often engaged quite late in the process to design a building. How can we actually limit the destruction of the industry at an earlier phase? We want to grow the scale of the workshop so that we can have a number of people from different trades all here working full time and kind of create this big fun house for reuse that then can, work alongside other development projects happening in the area. Our advice to designers would be to become interested in materials and design from there. Whether it's local materials or trying to source waste materials or becoming interested in natural materials, start with knowing more about where you're sourcing things from and how they're going to be recovered at their end of life, and then design from there.